Tarkir Dragonstorm spoilers are finally here, and today we get a look at the best Ugin ever, a super sweet Elspeth, a huge horde of dragons, and a ton of cards that look so fun, and I absolutely love, so let's break them down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron, and it's time for our first edition of Tarkir Dragonstorm spoilers. So spoiler season just kicked off a few hours ago with a huge stream from Wizards. Also, they messed up the timing, so a lot of the spoilers got posted early by Gizmodo, so Watsy, you might want to put the right time in your article next set release. But we got a ton of awesome cards to talk about today, and I gotta say, a brief aside, this is a set I've been waiting for. Tarkir for me is one of my most nostalgic blades. It's when I first really started making content. The original 34 Rhinos decks and all that stuff comes from original Tarkir, so I've already been super hyped for this set, and seeing these spoilers today, my hype level is through the roof. So we probably better get into it, start talking these amazing new cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can pre-order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Tarkir Dragonstorm. We kick things off today with a new Ugin, and this is one of the silliest planeswalkers that I think I've ever seen. So, Ugin Eye of the Storms, 7 mana colorless planeswalker, 7 loyalty. It's got a double static ability. When you cast this spell, exile up to 1 target permanent that's 1 or more colors, and then, whenever you cast a colorless spell, exile up to 1 target permanent that's 1 or more colors. That by itself is absurd. Like, imagine those abilities on an artifact. I bet it would cost at least 7 mana, and then we get all this planeswalker text on top of that. Plus 2, you gain 3 life and draw a card. 0, make 3 colorless mana, and then -11, search your library for any number of colorless non-land cards, exile them, and then shuffle. Until the end of turn, you can cast those cards without paying their mana cost. Ugin Eye of the Storms is just a ridiculous card, and it is 7 mana, so that's going to help keep it in check a little bit, but I think this card will have an impact all the way back to Modern at a minimum. It's just a absurd planeswalker. I didn't think it was possible for there to be an Ugin that was stronger than Ugin the Spirit Dragon, and I think that Ugin Eye of the Storms just might actually be the best Ugin ever printed. If you think about what this card does, the big calling card is its removal mode, those static abilities. So for 7 mana you cast it, you blow up your opponent's best thing, and then whenever you cast a colorless spell, you get to do it again. This reminds me a little bit of like Spine of Ishak, Karn Liberated, Ugin the Ineffable. It's a -3 ability, it's almost exactly the same ability, but Ugin Eye of the Storms, it does it whenever you cast a colorless card. So once this comes down, you can just zero it to make some mana, cast some colorless stuff, and be blowing up all of your opponent's colored permanents super quickly. If we look at the rest of the abilities, +2 is Revitalize. Strong. Like, you already start with 7 loyalty, so you +2 up to 9. Yeah, it doesn't really defend itself, although its triggered ability when you cast it defends it by blowing up your opponent's best thing. But gaining some life, getting up to 9 loyalty, drawing a card is nice. The zero mode basically a colorless dark ritual, and then the ultimate, should you get to it, it's essentially Enter the Infinite and Omniscience. Like, assuming you're playing a deck full of colorless cards, which is what Ugin wants you to do anyway, you essentially get to draw your deck and then cast it for free, which is absolutely ridiculous. So what are we doing with Ugin? First, it seems built to work in Tron decks back in Modern. I think that this is actually just better than Karn Liberated. Like, not that Tron's really much of a thing anymore. It's kind of been replaced by all these colorless Eldrazi decks with stuff like Ugin's Labyrinth. And I think Ugin works really well there too. If you're playing a bunch of cheap colorless Eldrazi, it's a good way to trigger Ugin a bunch of times. Plus, remember, it says colorless spells, and devoid things are technically colorless, like a Sowing Myco Spawn. It looks like a green card, but by the rules of Magic, it is colorless, so you can tutor it with Ugin's Ultimate, you can trigger Ugin when you cast it. So I think any of these big colorless decks in Modern, it's going to be good. In Standard, you can't just play it as like a standalone card to blow up your opponent's stuff. Probably the most hilarious thing to do with it is Doubling Season combo. And I know you're going to say, oh yeah, you broke Doubling Season or Innkeeper's Talent, which is completely fair. Those cards are super broken. But if you have either one of these, Innkeeper's Talent leveled up or a doubling season, you Ugin, you get enough loyalty to immediately ultimate, and then you just cast your deck for free, which seems kind of fun. The other place you could play this in Standard is in some sort of colorless deck, and we have a lot of good artifacts in Standard, but most of those decks revolve around repurposing base, simulacrum synthesizer, colored artifacts, so it's going to be interesting to see exactly how this shakes out. But like Ghost Vacuums, Nexus of Becoming, Transplators, Mainbind Tome, Solemn Simulacrum, all these cards work really well with Ugin as colorless spells that you can cast to blow things up, so I think that maybe we'll be able to harness its power in Standard as well. I could even see this working in Vintage, and I don't want to talk too much about Vintage because I just haven't played Vintage in a while and I'm not super up on the meta, but I knew though that Shops is like the best deck in Vintage, and Shops is full of cheap colorless spells like Grim Monoliths and Mox Sapphires. It used to play 4 Karn the Great Creators, but now you can only play 1 because it's restricted. I know that Mishra's Workshop itself doesn't make mana for Ugin, but it makes mana for all your Grim Monoliths, which can ramp you into Ugin, and then you just cast spells and blow stuff up and eventually cast your deck for free. So I think maybe it could work there, but I'm gonna have to ask some Vintage experts what they think about this card. As far as Commander, I think this card is really good as colorless removal, and one of the main uses of cards like Ugin the Spirit Reign, Karn Liberated, Ugin the Effable, is that you can play them in decks that are light on removal and use them as your removal spell. So if you're like mono blue and you have a hard time blowing up enchantments or artifacts, or you're mono red and you can't deal rid of that enchantment, you can play a card like Ugin to blow up whatever you need to blow up as long as it has colors on it, and then you're probably playing some mana rocks, probably some incidental solemns, other colorless cards like that can maybe re-trigger it more times. So I think it has uses there. It's also just going to be a staple in colorless decks. If you were a colorless deck or like a mono blue artifact deck that's playing a lot of colorless cards, this is going to be a ridiculous card in your deck, and because you can trigger it right away when you cast it, and potentially multiple times if you can cast some more colorless stuff in the same turn, it gets around the Commander problem with Planeswalkers, which is usually you play them and then they just get attacked down before doing much of anything, but Ugin's static abilities really solve that problem. So Ugin Eye of the Storms, the card's insane. Like, it's one of the most ridiculous Planeswalkers that I've seen in a long time. I think this card's gonna have a huge impact on Magic from Standard all the way back to Modern, maybe in Vintage and in Commander too. But we didn't get just one crazy Planeswalker today. We got 2, because we got Elspeth Stormslayer, and this one has another incredibly powerful static ability. So Elspeth Stormslayer, 5 mana, 5 loyalty. It says static ability: if 1 or more tokens would be created under your control, create twice that many tokens instead, and then +1, you make a 1/1 soldier, which will be 2 because you have Elspeth. 0, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Those creatures gain flying until your next turn. That ability is what really sells me on this card. The most exciting part is the static ability, which just does ridiculous things, but that 0 ability just lets you close out the game. And the -3, destroy a creature your opponent controls, mana value 3 or greater. So Elspeth Stormslayer, you might be thinking, oh, isn't this kind of like a Kaya Geist Hunter, which Kaya you can -2, and then if you make a token, you double it for the turn? It's kind of like that, but there is a huge difference between having to spend your loyalty ability to get the effect and just having it be a static ability. So Elspeth Stormslayer, I know Kaya kind of flopped, but don't let that ability ruin Elspeth for you, because Elspeth is no Kaya. If you want to know what Elspeth is, it's basically an Anointed Procession or a Mondrak with its static ability. The upside is you get all the Planeswalker attacks. The downside is it's probably going to be easier to kill than an Anointed Procession or a Mondrak. But you've seen some of the shenanigans that we've done with these cards in the past. Playing them in Standard, and in Timeless, and in Historic, and in Modern, doubling your tokens just does insane things once you build your deck around it. The rest of the Planeswalker, the +1 is basically Raise the Alarm. Even though it's 1 token, you're going to get 2 because of the static. The 0 ability, there's no great comparison for it, but it's kind of like a Requisition Raid mixed with Sky Shaper. And really, I think that mode is what makes me most excited about this card maybe working in actual decks. Because yes, doubling your tokens does ridiculous against the odds things, but as a Planeswalker, Elspeth's gonna die. The 0 mode, you can just play this and immediately put a counter on everything, send your team to the air, maybe kill your opponent on the spot. That's gonna be a close out the game as the top end of an aggro or mid-range deck ability. So Mondrak we already have in Standard. We can do a lot of the same things with Elspeth, which is the fair way of like, I play a Carrot Cake and I get 2 tokens. I play a Hair Apparent, I get more tokens. But then the real shenanigans are once you had like Rotodropic and Sack Outlets and you just like break Arena or Doppelking something and you break Arena. That's the kind of stuff that Elspeth Stormslayer can do. In Commander, I think this card is in the conversation for any deck that goes wide with tokens. If you were already playing Anointed Procession in your deck, I think you consider Elspeth. And the reason for that is not so much because it's an Anointed Procession. Anointed Procession ability is why it's in your deck, but the reason that I think it's worth playing, even though it's an Anointed Procession on a Planeswalker, like I said before, is that 0 ability. You just make a ton of tokens, you Elspeth your 0, your entire team game's flying, and it almost becomes like this mini Moonshaker Calvary. You don't get as huge of a buff by any means, but you send your entire team to the air, you pump your team, and you probably can just take out someone, maybe take out the table if you have a big enough board of tokens. So Elspeth Stormslayer, another really good Planeswalker. If it wasn't for Ugin being so ridiculous, I'd be talking about this as one of the best Planeswalkers that we've seen in quite a while. Ugin is just off the charts absurd though, but I think Elspeth Stormslayer, a really strong Planeswalker. I'm excited for the shenanigans that you can do with the Anointed Procession mode, but it also seems like just a really solid fair card as well. So 2 really good Planeswalkers in this set. Of course, the set's not Tarkir Planeswalkers. It's Tarkir Dragonstorm, and we have an entire cycle of Spirit Dragons. We already had Chico from a while ago. We talked about that one in the first spoiler video, so if you missed it, I'll put a card up or something. Click on it if you want to see about Chico. But we have the entire cycle, one for each of the wedges. So let's talk some Spirit Dragons, starting with our Abzan Spirit Dragon, Betor Kin to All. So 5 mana. Abzan for a 5/7 legendary Spirit Dragon. It is flying, and it says at the beginning of your end step, if creatures you control have total toughness of 10 or greater, you draw a card. Then if creatures you control have total toughness of 20 or greater, untap each creature you control. Then if creatures you control have total toughness of 40 or greater, each opponent loses half of their life rounded up. So Betor, along with being a pretty big-butted 5 mana 5/7 flyer, is basically a toughness matters card. It's a butts card. Also, what do you think about this showcase treatment? It's the first time we've looked at it. I'm gonna be curious to see what the super black looking showcase treatment looks like in person. I feel like it might be one of those treatments that looks a little weirder with digital renders compared to what they look like when you're actually holding the card. Definitely unique though. But Betor, what are we doing with Betor? So in standard, I don't think this is probably going to be a competitive card. If anything, it's an against the odds card, although it really disappointed me. If you think about what this is, it's a callback to Miles Area, where Miles Area cares about power rather than toughness, but you get an increasingly big reward for having a creature of 5 power, 10 power, 20 power. 20 power, you win the game. I feel like Betor, considering that 40 toughness is a pretty big number. I kind of wish that last reward was actually just like win the game or something like that. Maybe it'd be too strong for Commander. Maybe you gotta move the numbers up or something. But I feel like in standard, at least, if I can build a board that has 40 toughness on it and you're not dead and I'm not dead, I probably deserve to win the game with my Spirit Dragon. But in standard, I think you just play it with toughness matters stuff, right? Bedrock Tortoise, the Pride of the Hull Clad, any high toughness cheap creatures like Overgrown Zealot. Just try to get your toughness up as fast as possible so you can start drawing cards and tapping your stuff and eventually draining your opponent out of the game. Even though it's only half of your opponent's life, still, that's going to get your opponent's life total down pretty quickly if you can actually get 40 toughness on the battlefield. Plus, remember, Betor itself is 7 toughness, so to get the first mode, where this is a 5 mana 5/7 flyer that draws you a card on your end step, you really only need 3 extra toughness, which should be pretty easy to achieve. And because this triggers on your end step, even if it dies, you're likely to at least get 1 card draw out of it. So if you think of this as a 5 mana 5/7 flyer ETB draw card, that's actually not like a horrible creature. Plus you get a bunch of extra upside. In Commander, I think this is basically like a Doran card, right? You either play Betor as your commander and then overload your 99 with stuff like Dorans and Assault Formation so you can deal damage equal to your toughness rather than your power. Or you can do it the other way where you play Doran as your commander and then play Betor in the 99 and have this extra big payoff for all your toughness matter stuff. But that's really what you're doing with Betor. So Betor, I don't think it's like a super competitive card. I kind of wish that that last mode was like you win the game, just because it would make it an even better against the odds card. Although, like I said, maybe it'd be too strong in Commander, because you could probably get to 40 toughness pretty easily, so it was probably the right choice by Wizards. But it would be a much more spectacular against odds episode if we could win the game with this card. So I think this is probably a fun Commander Butts card, and in Standard, a good against the odds card. I'd be surprised if it was like a top tier competitive card, but you never know. We also got a Sultai Spirit Dragon, and I'm not sure if Teval is the most busted card in the set or the most unplayable card in the set. It's one of those cards where there's no middle ground here. This card is either going to be insane and we're going to be like, oh my god, we need to ban this card, or this card is going to be absolutely horrible, and it's like, why did we ever think that card might be good? So Teval, Arbiter of Virtue, 5 mana for a 6/6. It's a Sultai card. It's a Spirit Dragon. It's got flying and lifelink. Its first line of text, spells you cast have Delve, which is ridiculous. Delve is one of the most broken mechanics that Wizards has printed in the modern era of Magic. Being able to exile cards from your graveyard to make mana is just an inherently strong effect. So that is ridiculous. If the card stopped there, Teval would be absolutely busted, one of the best cards in Standard, but it's got a drawback. Whenever you cast a spell, you lose life equal to its mana value. So that means you can't just really pop off with Teval, because if you do, you're going to burn yourself out of the game. Also worth mentioning, that ability triggers whenever you cast any spell, not when you delve this spell. So you can't just like play Teval and be like, I'm gonna wait and use its ability on, one card in the future to delve something and avoid all this damage, but just any spell you cast is going to start burning you out of the game. It is nice that Teval has lifelink, so that's going to help you pay for some of the spells that you cast in terms of life, but I'm not sure it's enough by itself. So that's why I'm not sure on this card. The delve mode I think is busted, but are you going to kill yourself too often as you try to cast your spells for it to be worth it? And I feel like it's going to be one of those cards we're going to have to play with to find out. So if you think about this card, it's like a Baneslayer Angel, even better, it's a 6/6 Baneslayer Angel that turns all your cards into treasure crews, which is ridiculous, but then it also turns all your spells into like an upgraded, equal to mana value Eben Drake. And I just don't know how to mash all those things together and make sense of this. So if you want to look at the upside of the card, how can we do broken things with this? And the first thing I thought of was X spells. So we have like in Standard Genesis Wave. Imagine just playing a self-mill deck where you get a ton of cards in your graveyard. You drop Teval for 5 mana, have 3 green mana left open, exile all your graveyard to Genesis Wave for like 20 or something. You probably win the game. It's also great with Exsanguinate. You could actually just kill people. If you get 20 cards in your graveyard, Teval, 2 black mana, exile everything, Exsanguinate, burn your opponent out of the game. The only thing is, you got to keep in mind, if you cast a Genesis Wave for 20, you might just die, because the mana value of Genesis Wave is going to be, 23? So it's going to be tricky to, balance all that out. That's why Exsanguinate's so good, is you can burn your opponent with Exsanguinate and gain back the life that you're spending for Teval for the Delve mode. Also in older formats, hilarious with Villainous Wealth, just steal your opponent's entire deck. So if you can either gain enough life, or find some way to not die to Teval, making you lose life for casting your spells, it can just do absurdly ridiculous things. The wildest part of the spells have Delve mode is that there's no restriction. It's not like colored spells or non-artifact spells. So in theory, in Standard, we can just go Teval, exile 9 cards from our graveyard, take 9, Portal to Phyrexia on turn 5, or maybe on turn 3 if we have Llanowar Elves and Overlord of the Hauntwoods. In Modern, you can just play this and be like, exile 15, Emrakul you? It's just so absolutely ridiculous. In Commander, I think this is going to be a really, really, really fun build around, because I think this, and I love this card. I love this design so incredibly much. I don't even care if the card's good. I love that there's a drawback on it. I feel like drawbacks like this are something that's been missing from Magic cards. We used to see way more cards with downsides, and recently it seems like Wizards has worked really hard to remove anything that even sort of looks like a downside, because new players don't like it or whatever. But to me, this downside is what makes Teval so exciting. So in Commander, this card is super busted. The Delve mode, you got 40 life to work with. It's even stronger in Commander, but you're going to have to find a way to counteract the life loss from casting your spells. So I'm thinking you play like Exsanguinates, you play Martial Wretched Sorrow, maybe Grey Merchant, Hydroid Crosses is awesome, especially these big X spells, and you can just like dump your graveyard with Delve into casting these spells. Gain back with Exsanguinate and Commander more life than you put into it, because you hit all of your opponents with it, gain back most of your life with Hydroid Crosses, draw a ton of cards, and then just keep the chain going. So I think this is going to be a really, really fun, interesting build around, where you're going to be like self-mill to fill your graveyard, you're going to need life gain effects to not die to the ability, but if you can get it just right, and you can thread that needle, your reward is going to be an incredibly powerful commander. So Teval, still not sure if the card's good or not. It's either, like I said, broken or unplayable, but it is easily one of my favorite cards from the set so far, and definitely one of the sweetest Spirit Dragons. Speaking of super sweet Spirit Dragons, we also got our Mardu Spirit Dragon in Neriv, Heart of the Storm, and I also love this card. So it's a 4-mana Mardu 4/5 Spirit Dragon, and it has flying, and its ability is, if a creature you control that entered this turn would deal damage, it deals twice that damage instead. So Haste a Monicon, entered this turn a Monicon. It's some sort of a Monicon. If you think about what Neriv is, it's a pretty on-curve 4-mana 4/5 flyer that's like a Furnace of Wrath or Panner Monicon for creatures dealing damage on the turn that they entered. So how do we actually build around Neriv? And there's a few different ways to do this. So first, creatures that just directly deal damage when they enter are going to work with Neriv. So you cast an Overlord of the Boiler Biggles or a Tyrant of Care Ridges. They have Enters triggers that deal 4 damage. If you have Neriv out, you're going to deal 8 damage instead. Pretty straightforward. Same with Voldiran Thrillseeker or like Dragonhawk Fate's Tempest. You play it when it enters or attacks, you exile cards equal to the number of creatures you have with power 4 or greater. On the end step, any of those cards that you didn't play from exile deals 2 damage to each opponent for those cards. It's going to double up with Neriv if it's a turn that you played Dragonhawk Fate's Tempest. So that's number one. Any ETB style effect that deals damage, gonna work with Neriv. It also works with Haste. So it's like Haste Demonicon. If you have a Neriv out and you Aurelia, it's going to deal double damage, or a Druid Hazaret or a Charming Scoundrel, however you haste your stuff in, because the creature entered the battlefield this turn, it's going to deal double the damage. It's also hilariously sweet with Nihiri's Resolve. Nihiri's Resolve plumps all your creatures and gives them haste, so any creature you play is going to be able to swing the turn that you play it to trigger Neriv's ability for double damage. More importantly, on your end step, you can exile any number of your artifacts or creatures that aren't tokens, and they come back into play on your next upkeep. So there are going to be creatures that entered this turn every single turn. So I imagine if you ever get Neriv and Nihiri's Resolve going, you're going to kill your opponent super quickly. Once you get back to older formats, which in this case, probably Commander, because I don't really see Neriv making it in Modern, you get some cool enchantment shenanigans, like Warstorm Surge. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals damage equal to its power to target player. So if you have Warstorm Surge in Neriv, and then Dragon Tempest, kind of the same thing for dragons on the battlefield, but if you have these with Neriv, any creature that you cast or dragon you cast is going to trigger them to deal double damage. You're going to just wipe out everyone super quickly. And this is also like sneakily a good dragon commander. It looks like a generic haste commander, but when you consider that dragons, some of the best dragons are stuff like Scourge of Valkis, which whenever it or another dragon enters, it deals X damage to a creature, player, where X is the number of dragons you control, or Terror of the Peaks. When a creature enters, it deals damage to the creature's power to any target. You can set up some ridiculous dragon combo turns where you play a Terror of the Peaks and just keep playing creatures and burn your opponent out of the game with double damage from Neriv. Plus you're in red, so you have stuff like Anger to give everything haste. So I think that Neriv, it's actually a super sweet card. This is another one I'm really excited to build around. I think with enough brewing, it can be a good card in Standard, and it's definitely a cool dragon commander. We also have our final Spirit Dragon, our Temur Spirit Dragon, Ureni the Song Unending, and this one's pretty simple. So it is the 8-mana 10/10 Spirit Dragon with flying and protection from white and black, which is probably the two best protection colors removal-wise, and then it says when it enters, it deals X damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures or planeswalkers your opponents control, where X is the number of lands you control. So this is essentially Dragonlord of Tarka, all grown up for 2025. When we last went to Tarkir and we had Dragonlord of Tarka, it was actually very heavily played in Standard. You would just ramp into it, cast it, deal 5 damage to kill a creature or something, and then attack with the 8/8 Flying Trampler. Ureni seems like the upgraded version of this. You're probably getting more damage out of it, or at least it scales equal to the number of lands you control. You get protection out of it, you get a bigger body, and I think this card is probably pretty good in Standard. If you're a deck that can ramp into this, like Overlord of the Hall was really good at adding extra lands to the battlefield, or if you're me, do Doppelgang shenanigans, it seems pretty realistic that this can be like a Hard Wrath, or like a Plague Wind, really, that's going to wipe out all of your opponent's creatures or planeswalkers, and leave behind this massive 10/10 body for you. So I think this might actually be a competitive card where if you're a ramp deck and you're worried about aggro, you just play this as like your sweeper and you just wipe out your opponent's board and then go on to win the game with your massive 10/10. It's also worth mentioning, Pro White and Black is actually really good as far as dodging removal. I would say the two colors that are most likely to just be able to kill the Spirit Dragon are going to be Black and White with Go for the Throat and Get Lost. So these protections are going to be really, really key to keeping it on the battlefield, which makes it even more powerful in Standard. So Ureni, I think this one's pretty straightforward. It's very much Dragonlord of Tarka, the 2025 edition. If you can ramp into this, it's going to be a bad time for your opponent. And I think also in Commander, you just play it in any Dragon deck in its colors. It's going to be really good. Moving on to the rest of our mythics, we also got a new Taigam in Taigam Master Opportunist. And this card, I'm on the fence about. So it's a 2-mana 2/2, a Grizzly Bear, but a legendary human monk. And then it has a new mechanic in Flurry, which actually isn't a new mechanic, but it's a new keyword for something we've seen in the past. Flurry is essentially when you cast your second spell each turn, you do something. In the case of Taigam, when you cast your second spell each turn, you copy it, and then you exile the spell you cast with 4 time counters on it. If it doesn't have suspend, it gains suspend. So 4 turns later, you're going to actually get that spell and be able to cast it for free. If it's a creature, it gets to come into play with haste. So we're going to teach a new generation about how things coming off suspend have haste for some reason that no one really understands. But Taigam, when I first read this card, I thought it was absolutely busted, because I thought how this worked was when you cast your second spell for a turn, you would copy that spell, the original would resolve, the copy would resolve, and then you would also get one that was suspended for 4 turns in the future. But it turns out that's not exactly how it works. If you read it carefully, what actually happens is when you cast your second spell, you're going to get a copy of it. That copy is going to resolve, the original is going to go to exile, so you don't get any extra value right away. What you're going to get is 4 turns in the future, when the card comes off of suspend, then you're going to get value out of that card when you get to cast that copy of it for free. So essentially, Taigam is a 2-drop that can copy every second spell of the turn that you cast, but you gotta wait 4 turns to get that copy. So is this card actually good? And I think it might just be too slow. Like, I was trying to think about how this would actually work. And let's say you're playing Standard and you're like, all right, turn 2 I play my Taigam, turn 3 I play a 1-drop like Duress, and then I get lost. So I get my get lost, I kill your thing, and then it goes into exile with suspend, and then I need to wait 4 turns. So turn 7, I'm gonna get my get lost again. Is that actually worth it? And I'm not sure. Like, it is free value, and it should not be overstated. The Taigam's just a 2-drop. It's not like we're playing some 5-mana thing to make this happen. So maybe it's just so cheap and efficient, it's going to work out. But it does seem pretty slow. If you're playing against mono red or something, by the time your stuff comes off of suspend, you're probably already going to be dead. One of the most intriguing parts about this card, though, is it works with anything, right? So on the stack, anything's a spell, which means what you can do with Taigam is use it to make copies of permanents if you want to get a token copy of them. So imagine you cast a 1-mana spell like Duress, and then you cast 3 Blind Mice as your second spell of the turn. You're going to get the original in exile for 4 turns later. More importantly, you're going to get a token copy right now, and then you can start doing the 3 Blind Mice shenanigans, where once you get to the second lore counter, it can copy itself because it's a token, and then that one can copy itself because it's a token, and you just get this endless stream of 3 Blind Mice value. So some of those shenanigans are pretty neat. As a way to turn anything into a token, I'm actually pretty intrigued by Taigam, because there's some things that just really care about having tokens on the battlefield. If you want to play this brutally, it's probably going to be strongest with extra turn spells in Commander, like cast a Time Warp, get an extra turn, go to your extra turn, you're going to get the one in exile, your extra turn can remove one of the counters from suspend, so you're already getting closer to the next Time Warp, and then a couple turns later you get another one, and then you time stretch your Nexus of Fate. Thankfully, looping extra turns disallowed at lower brackets in Commander now, which is probably a good thing, because it would be really easy to do with Taigam. As far as where you actually play this in Commander, I guess you could kind of play it anywhere for value. I'm really like on the fence. Maybe this card is way stronger than I think. I keep going back and forth on this one. It's probably going to be at its best though. Like Obeka Splitter of Seconds, getting a whole bunch of upkeeps is a good way to speed through Suspend to remove more time counters because you remove a time counter on your upkeep. So if you get a bunch of upkeeps, you're going to be getting that second spell with Taigam way quicker. Or if you're playing other effects that just care about rebounding or suspending cards, Joyra, O'Hare Patotic, things like that, I think I would play Taigam. But it might just be worth it to play it for value. The thing about Commander is Commander games go way longer. My biggest concern about playing this in a format like Standard or definitely Modern is the games just go by pretty fast. And if you're dying on turn 3 or turn 4 or turn 5, you're just not going to get value out of this because you're going to be dead before the card comes off of Suspend. But in Commander, when games are going to turn 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 20 in some cases, then I think you're way more likely to have enough time to get value out of this. Plus, if you play this as your commander, yeah, you're restricted to being mono blue, but knowing that you're always going to have this on turn 2, you can probably set up some pretty brutal lines. We also got a reprint mythic in Craterhoof Behemoth. Hoof, there it is, back in Standard for the first time in 15 years. So I'm sure you know this card. It's one of the most iconic cards in Commander. I gotta say, I love the new art where it looks like a really foresty woolly mammoth for some reason, but it's a 8-mana 5/5 with haste. When it enters, creatures you control get trampled in +X/+X, where X is the number of creatures you control. So I'm not going to go into the virtues of Craterhoof. You know what's one of the best finishers in Commander? It's like a $35 card. Hopefully this gets the price down a little bit for people that want to buy it for Commander for the first time. The real question is, does this matter for Standard? And I think the answer is a definite maybe. We already have Nissa Ascendant Animist in Standard. Nissa Ascendant Animist can kind of do a Craterhoof impression with its -7, where you just play it and trample your team and hopefully win on the spot. Craterhoof does the same thing. In some ways, it's better than Nissa. The biggest upside is you also get the big hasty body of Craterhoof itself, so it deals even more damage. Although, usually the problem with Nissa is not that you don't have enough damage to win the game, it's keeping enough creatures on the battlefield to actually make it work, or getting enough mana to make it work. The good news about Craterhoof is we got the pieces for it. We got Elves in Standard, we got Elvish Archer, we got Llanowar Elves. That's traditionally one of the best homes for Craterhoof. I think what would really set Craterhoof apart would be some sort of Green Sun Zenith effect. That would definitely make it better than Nissa, and we haven't seen Nissa be good enough to make these green aggro decks really work. But if we get some sort of Green Sun Zenith, a Finale of Devastation style effect, some way to tutor out our elves and then eventually tutor out the Craterhoof when it's time to win the game, that might be the thing that actually turns Craterhoof into a all-star in Standard and maybe brings back green in Standard. The other place we might be able to see this card is in something like the infamous Hoof There It Is deck. So Hoof There It Is was a deck from back in 2012. Brad Nelson, back then very young Brad Nelson, built this deck, and the deck was super cool. The entire deck was mana dorks, ways to fill the graveyard, Unburial Rites, and then Craterhoof Behemoth. And the idea was you play your mana dorks, you fill the graveyard, you mill over Craterhoof and Unburial Rites, you flash back Unburial Rites, you get the Craterhoof, you trample over, you win the game. I think we might be able to do something pretty similar. Maybe we just play a bunch of mana dorks and self-mill stuff, cash grabs and whatnot, and then just zombify Craterhoof into play. So it's worth keeping in mind, this might be a sneaky good reanimation target. We might have to try to bring Hoof There It Is back in Standard. So Craterhoof Behemoth, I love the new art. I'm interested to see what this means for Standard. I think it will have an impact, but we're going to have to wait and see because green just hasn't been the best color in Standard recently. Worst case, great Commander reprint that hopefully will bring the price down for a bit. Although I will say, if you're thinking about picking up Craterhoofs with this reprint, it is the exact kind of card that drops when it gets reprinted and then goes right back up to $30 because it just has so much demand from Commander players. Our final mythic of the day is a Mardu enchantment in All Out Assault. And I gotta say, I love this entire set. This was already the set of the year I was most excited for, just because Tarkir is really nostalgic for me. It's not when I started playing Magic, but when I really started making content. So if you look at some of the OG original budget Magic decks, against the odds decks, they're all with cons cards, and I love 3-color sets, so I was already super hyped for this set, and the spoilers today They are exactly what I was hoping for. It is like literally perfect Wizards, so well done. And all this to say, one of the things Wizards has mentioned before is with 3-color cards, you really want those cards to feel like they're all of those colors. And I feel like All Out Assault is one of the best examples I've ever seen with this, where it's really like a red card, a white card, and a black card stapled together into one effect. So as we read it, see if you can pick out what each color is doing here. So All Out Assault, 5-mana enchantment. Creatures you control get +1/+1 and have Death Touch. And when this enchantment enters, if it's your main phase, there's an additional combat phase after this phase, followed by an additional main phase. And when you attack this turn, untap each creature you control. So essentially, from white, you get a Glorious Anthem, giving your creatures +1/+1. From black, you get giving all your creatures Death Touch. And then from red, you get a Relentless Assault extra combat step. And I feel like this card might be pretty good. So if you want exact comparisons, it's Glorious Anthem. I guess I had to go with Bowl of Nylea because I actually couldn't find a card that was just static, all your creatures have Death Touch. Maybe I missed it. If I did, let me know, because there's probably a better example out there. And then Relentless Assault for the extra combat steps. I feel like this card, I don't know exactly what it's going to do in Standard. It is 5 mana. There is a lot of enchantment removal in Standard, although you do get its Enters trigger, even if it immediately dies to enchantment removal, which is a nice bonus. I think the most intriguing part about this card is it's a spell effect, or Relentless Assault extra combat step effect, but it's not a permanent. So that means you can blink it with like Scroll Shift, Flicker of Fate to get even more extra combats out of it, which seems pretty powerful and pretty funny. It's also possible, we mentioned before how, like, I couldn't find a card that just gives all your stuff Death Touch. Maybe that's the mode that you build around with this card. You're just giving your entire team Death Touch because you're playing a bunch of Prodigal Pyromancers, let's say. These creatures that tap to deal 1 damage to anything, but because you have Death Touch, they just kill anything. So it'd be another really fun way to build around this card. The other possibility is playing this card in Commander. And in Commander, I think it's pretty straightforward. If you are a deck that wants extra combat steps, and you happen to be in the colors of All Out Assault, and the biggest downside of all these 3-color cards, it's not that they're not powerful, it's just color identity, right? So if you're going to play All Out Assault, it's never going to be in a monocolor or a 2-color deck. It's always going to be in the 3+ color deck. So there's going to be some decks where you'd be like, man, I wish I could play this card, but it's just not in my colors because I'm Rakdos instead of Mardu or whatever. I'm Boros instead of Mardu. But if you're a Mardu deck or a 5 or 4 color deck that wants an extra combat step, I feel like this card is an easy fit in your deck. So like Ish and 2 Heavens in 1, Edgar Markov, where you're just going super wide. I think you're going to get plenty of value out of playing this card. So All Out Assault, I love this card. I love the design. I think the card, it might be like fringe in Standard. Worst case, it seems like a cool Commander card. Moving into the world of rares. First off, we're going to go through all the new mechanics from the set that we haven't talked about yet. So first off, we have the Mobilize mechanic from Voice of Victory. So Voice of Victory, 2-mana 1/3 human bard with a super sweet guitar. It has Mobilize 2. So when it attacks, you create 2 tapped and attacking 1/1 red warrior creature tokens, sack them at the beginning of the next end step, and then it says, your opponents can't cast spells during your turn. So Mobilize, the number can change. You could have Mobilize 1, you could have Mobilize 3, but essentially it's make this number of 1/1 red warrior creature tokens tapped and attacking, and then they go away on your end step. So the mechanic seems kind of cute. As far as the card itself, I think Voice of Victory is actually really good because it's basically a more aggressive Grand Abolisher. Like, yes, you lose the ability to shut down your opponent from activating abilities on your turn, although honestly, that is pretty fringe on Grand Abolisher. The big deal about a Grand Abolisher effect is you play it and you make sure your opponent can't cast an instant speed removal. They can't cast a counter spell during your turn. Basically, if you're some sort of combo deck, or you just don't like getting countered against, a Crim type player that's playing all the control stuff, it's a really nice option to know that you can execute your game plan. And Voice of Victory, it's just a more aggressive version. Grand Abolisher is just a Grizzly Bear. Voice of Victory, it essentially attacks for 3 thanks to the tokens that it makes. Plus, it has some extra toughness. So in Standard, I could see playing this in a go wide deck. I was thinking like a go wide War Leader's Call Boros style deck where you have War Leader's Call. So your tokens from Mobilize are going to be 2/2s. And when they enter, they deal a damage. And then maybe you play Sanguine Evangelist and you just kind of go aggro and attack, kind of like the Boros Convoke decks essentially. The other place I could see playing this card would maybe be in the Mice deck. The thing about the Mice deck is, if you can't interact with the Mice deck, they will kill you in one big turn by casting some pump spells. And Voice of Victory, you can just play this to know that your opponent can't interact with you. So you play the Voice of Victory. If your opponent wants to interact with you, they got to kill the voice first so they can interact on your turn. If they don't kill the voice, you're just free to Heartfire Hero, pump it, cast all of your monstrous rages, and kill your opponent in one big attack. So I could see that being a possibility as well. It's also kind of cute with Blood Artist effects. That's the other intriguing part of Mobilize, is the tokens sacrifice themselves. So if you attack with this and make those tokens, on your end step, the token sacrifice is going to trigger the Blood Artist a couple of times to drain your opponent for even more damage. So maybe this could also work in like a sack deck, an aristocrat style deck. In Commander, you can play this in literally any deck that doesn't want to have to deal with counter spells. I am definitely not above just throwing a Grand Abolisher into a deck and being like, I just don't want to deal with you countering my spells today, so I'm just playing this card. You can do the same thing with Voice of Victory, although it's going to be at its best in specific commanders. Either Staxy commanders like Grand Arbiter, where you just really want to annoy your opponents, because some people will get salty about this card. The other place is kind of combo-y commanders like Kalia the Vast or Winota. If you can stick your commander for one turn, you probably win the game by putting a whole bunch of stuff into play, or a huge demon or angel or dragon into play. In Voice of Victory is a great way to make sure you get that one turn. You play Voice of Victory so your opponent can't interact, and then you play your Kalia with haste or your Winota, and you just win the game with this huge big turn. So Voice of Victory, the card seems really good. I think it's very similar to Grand Abolisher, but in many ways, it's just going to be a better Grand Abolisher. Plus, the Mobilize mechanic has some interesting tricks. We also got the new Omen mechanic in Marang River Regent and Bloomvine Regent. So how does Omen work? If you look at these cards, they look a lot like adventures, but they're not exactly adventures. Although in your hand, a card like Marang River Regent is actually going to play a lot like an adventure. So it's a 6-mana 6/7 flying dragon that when it enters, you can bounce 2 non-land permanents, but it's also Catch and Coil, a 4-mana instant that's an Omen that says draw 3 cards and discard a card, and then shuffle it into its owner's library. So in your hand, this is going to play just like an adventure. You can cast the big dragon, and then you're done with it, or you can cast the instant mode. If you cast the instant mode, this is where it's different than adventures. If you cast the instant mode, rather than going to exile and allowing you to cast the dragon mode in the future, it's going to shuffle into your deck, and then eventually you can draw it again, and then you can choose, do I cast the Omen side again? Do I cast the dragon side this time? So that's the idea of Omen, and I gotta say, I love this design philosophy. One of the biggest issues with dragons is they tend to be really expensive, and because they're really expensive, they're hard to play in competitive decks. So how do you make these big expensive dragons more playable in a format like Standard? What if you attach cheap spells to them? So in the early game, you can cast the cheap spell mode, and in the late game, you can cast the big dragon mode once you have the mana. So I feel like this is a great way to try to make dragons a little bit better in competitive formats like Standard. As far as the cards themselves, Marang River Regent, I think it's okay. I mean, a 6-mana 6/7 flyer that bounces 2 things, actually like pretty big bodied. And then the draw mode's not bad. 4 mana for draw 3, discard a card. It's essentially Ancestral Reminiscence, except even better because it's an instant speed. So I could see playing this card in some sort of dragon deck or spellslinger deck. As far as the other option, Bloomvine Regent, this one's actually pretty spicy. So it's Omen mode, claim territory, search your library for up to 2 basic forests, reveal them, put 1 into the battlefield, tap the other into your hand, and then it's dragon mode, a 5 mana 4/5 flyer that says when it or another dragon you control enters, you gain 3 life. So essentially you get a Nissa's Pilgrimage minus his spell mastery, a cultivate, but only for basic forests, and then this big life gaining dragon. And this card also seems kind of fine, like just a solid mid-rangey threat. The only downside of this card is you need to play enough basic forests to support it. So it's not going to be good in like the Domain Overlord deck or whatever, because you're probably just not playing enough forests in some sort of 4 or 5 color pile. But as long as you have enough forests to support it, a bad cultivate into a pretty reasonable 5-drop dragon that gains you some life seems like a pretty solid card. So I really love the Omen mechanic. Our next mechanic is Renew on Qarsi Revenant. So it's a 3-mana 3/3 flying death touch lifelinking vampire that is Renew with 3 mana, which means exile it from your graveyard and put a flying counter, a death touch counter, and a lifelink counter on target creature activated only as a sorcery. So Renew is essentially you can exile something from your graveyard and then you're gonna do something. It's not always gonna be adding keywords or whatever. It could be draw a card or add some counters, +1/+1 counters or something, but you get some value from exiling that card from your graveyard. So I think the mechanic's neat. It's another way that you can get extra value out of one of your cards, which We've kind of had a lot of mechanics like that in this set. But the card itself, 3-mana 3/3 Flying Death Touch lifelink, as soon as I saw it, I was like, wow, look at how far we've come. I don't know if you were playing Magic in like 2010, but when they first printed Vampire Nighthawk, a 3-mana 2/3 Flying Death Touch lifelinking uncommon, it was actually like a legit creature. It was one of the best uncommons of all time or of its era. It was a really, really powerful card. Qarsi Revenant is just like Vampire Nighthawk plus. You get more stats, you can give its abilities to other things with redo. So it's kind of wild to see just how much Vampire Nighthawk has been power crept out of existence. But I think Qarsi Revenant might actually be a pretty good card. So what are we doing with this card? First, really good in decks that care about keywords. So Soul Flayer decks, Urborg Scavenger, still in standard. This has 3 keywords on it. If you exile it to a Soul Flayer or Urborg Scavengers, it's going to get Flying Death Touch and Lifelink, which is pretty nice on one card. It's also a Vampire. We got a little bit of Vampire stuff in standard. I don't know if it's enough to make the deck good, but maybe it's definitely a boost of power to vampires. The other possibility is black's a good color in standard. Maybe this is just like a good card. Like, I'm not sure if it's Preacher of the Schism good, which I think is the #1 black 3-drop right now in standard. Is it quite as good as Preacher of the Schism in a vacuum? It doesn't draw cards, so maybe not. But I think it's very close. So I could see just playing this as a generic threat in some sort of black mid-range deck, black aggro deck, because the combination of Flying Death Touch and Lifelink and its renewability actually very effective. The other thing you can do with this card is try to give its abilities to creatures that really want those abilities. Like, for example, giving a Goblin Sharpshooter, which can tap to deal a damage to any creature or player, and then when a creature dies, you get to untap it. Giving a card like that Death Touch turns it into the ultimate machine gun, where you like tap it to kill a creature, and then it dies, and you untap it, and then you tap it to kill a creature because of Death Touch, it dies, you untap it. So that seems really fun as well. In Commander, I think outside of just playing it as a vampire card, which is a fine way to play it, an Edgar Markov or whatever, probably going to be a keyword soup card. Some sort of Cathril, Indominus Rex, also super cute with Skullbriar, because Skullbriar keeps its counters as it moves through zones. So if you can get Qarsi Revenant's Death Touch, Lifelink, Flying counters on Skullbriar, you make a pretty scary threat, and those counters are going to stick around forever. So Qarsi Revenant, the card seems really good. It's Vampire Nighthawk updated for 2025 with a pretty powerful new mechanic. Our next mechanic, we have Endures in Anafenza Unyielding Lineage. So Anafenza, a 3-mana 2/2 legendary spirit soldier with flash and first strike. And then it says, when another non-token creature you control dies, Anafenza endures 2. So what is endures 2? It means you either put 2+1/+1 counters on the creature, or you create a 2/2 white spirit creature token. So if that ability sounds familiar, it's actually very similar to Fabricate, which we saw back in Kaladesh when we first went to Kaladesh. Fabricate was when the creature enters, you either put that many +1/+1 counters on it, just like Endures, or you make that many 1/1 servos. The difference is, rather than making a bunch of 1/1s, Endures makes one larger creature equal to its Endures number. So very similar to Fabricate though, and I think Anafenza is actually probably a pretty powerful card. If you think about what this is, 3-mana 2/2 flash first strike doesn't sound that great. But the fact that when a creature dies, any non-token creature that you control, you get to endure 2, I think that's what makes this card. So you can flash this in response to a removal spell, the creature dies, it becomes a 3-mana 4/4 first striker, or you can make it 2/2 if you want to go wide instead of growing your Anafenza. So I think it's pretty easy to turn this into a playable card. It's probably going to be at its best in some sort of sack deck. If you're playing like the Aristocrat, Rally the Ancestor style deck, Raise the Past style deck, I think it might be at its best in some sort of Raise the Past Aristocrat style deck. We played one of these decks not that long ago. It's kind of like a Zahar, except you don't have to get to max speed. Whenever a creature dies, you just get to make a 2/2. So if you're going to be sacking things a bunch of time, we got Bloodghast in standard now. It's a great way to generate more value as you're sacrificing your own board. So I think that's one home for this card. It's also a soldier. Remember when soldiers were good? Actually, standard, it rotates so slowly now. I forgot that soldiers were actually still in standard, but right after Brothers War came out, soldiers were like one of the best decks in standard. So maybe we get one last gasp run of soldiers in standard before they rotate this summer, with Anafenza helping just a nice addition, some protection from Wrath and removal for the deck. The other possibility is you just play this for value. Like, I feel like a 3-mana 2/2 that can grow +2/+2 whenever one of your non-tokens dies with flash and first strike, that might just be good enough to, like, you wait till your opponent goes to kill your Warden of the Inner Sky, and you just flash in Anafenza. Now you got a 4/4 first striker for 3 mana. That seems fine in any sort of, like, white aggro style deck. So I think Anafenza, probably pretty good, and the Endures mechanic seems very powerful. Our final mechanic, they didn't spoil any rares for this mechanic, so we're going to use Roamer's Routine to show it off, is Harmonize. So Roamer's Routine, 3 mana, search your library for your basic land, put it into play tapped, and then it has Harmonize of 5 mana, which means you can cast it from your graveyard, and you may tap a creature you control to reduce its generic mana cost by X, where X is a creature's power. So Harmonize, it's essentially Flashback, except you can reduce the cost of flashing the card back by tapping one of your creatures. We'll have to see what we get. I don't think Roamer's Routine itself really going to make it as a constructed card. But again, Harmonize is another, your cards are actually 2 cards mechanic. So I expect the mechanic will probably be pretty good, even if this card itself is just a random common. Next up, we get a new Temur 3-dropping, Temur Battlecrier. So a 3 mana, including a green, a blue, and a red, 4/3. It's an Orc Ranger, and it says, during your turn, spells you cast cause 1 less to cast for each creature you control with power 4 or greater, which is kind of a wild ability. That means by itself, all the spells during your turn cost 1 less just from having this because it has 4 power. But if you have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 20... creatures with 4 greater power on the battlefield, this can be giving you a massive cost reduction, which is probably more of a commander thing. I don't know what the odds are of being able to stick like 5 4-power creatures in standard. If you do that, what are the odds that you haven't already won the game? But this does seem like an incredibly explosive card. If you think about what it is, its base land by itself is essentially Cloud Key, except Cloud Key for all of your permanents on a 4/3 body, which is already really good. And then it's also like a Samet driving force, this massive cost reduction if you can get a few additional 4 greater power creatures on the battlefield. So this card, I'm really not sure how good it's going to be. I can see its ceiling being super duper high, but like I said in standard, I'm just not sure how realistic it is to stack up a bunch of 4+ power creatures without winning the game. Although if you can, it can do some hilarious things. It's probably going to be at its best with X spells. Like imagine Genesis Wave or Gold Vein Hydra. If you can get 3 creatures with power 4 or greater, get a 3 mana discount, it's going to become much easier to cast a huge Genesis Wave. Or you cast a big Gold Vein Hydra to get another creature with power 4 or greater to give you an even bigger discount to then cast your Genesis Wave. So it seems like a cool X-Spell style card. But as I said, it just kind of dies to everything. So I imagine you're going to play this more fairly in standard, where a 3 mana 4/3 that ramps you a little bit isn't really a bad card if you can get value out of it for a turn or 2. But between Go for the Throat and Lightning Strike and This Town and Sunfall, probably not going to be able to stack up that big of a board. In Commander though, that's where it might become more realistic to actually be able to pop off with this card and have like 3 or 4 creatures in this huge discount and have some sort of huge storm turn. I don't know what deck you're going to put it in. That's another question. But it does seem like a powerful effect if you can make it work. We also got a new Siege enchantment in Frostcliff Siege. So this is our Izzet Siege. So it's an enchantment. And when it enters, you get to choose either Jeskai or Temur. If you choose Jeskai, whenever 1 or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you draw a card. If you choose Temur, creatures you control have +1/+0 and trample and haste. So this is a very weird siege, because I feel like Jeskai mode is actually pretty bad, but the Temur mode is actually incredibly powerful. So why do I not like the Jeskai mode? Well, when you read it, at first glance, it seems like a Binding of Thassa, right? Which is a very powerful effect. The problem is, if you read it closely, it says whenever 1 or more creatures deal combat damage, you draw a card. That means if you attack an opponent with 100 creatures, you still only draw 1 card. When if you had a Binding of Thassa, if you hit someone with 100 creatures, you're going to draw 100 cards and, I guess, die to milling out. But discounting that, you get to draw way more cards. You can get around that a little bit in Commander, because it says damage to a player. So if you're playing Commander, you can like send 1 creature this way, 1 this way, 1 this way, and if you hit each opponent, you could draw up to 3 cards each turn cycle. But I still feel like the Jeskai mode, pretty underpowered, doubly so in Standard. On the other hand, 3 mana for an enchantment that gives all your creatures not just +1/+0, not just trample, but also haste, is really good. I couldn't find many cards in Magic that give trample and haste. It's like a Chroma Memorial, Kenrith the Return King. there's not a lot of cards that do this, and I feel like that mode is really strong. Like, imagine in Standard just hasting in Captain Howlers, hasting in Urenis. Like, any big creature having trample and haste is going to be absolutely a devastating amount of damage coming in and smashing your opponent. So that by itself is already very exciting. But then once you get back to Commander, I think this card's even better because cards like Fervor and Rising of the Day and Anger are already staples. The only downside is you are in 2 colors, so you got to worry about color identity. But discounting color identity, I feel like you can play this in a ton of different Commander decks because the combination of hasting in your team and trampling up your team and pumping your team is actually very powerful. So I think that Frostcliff Siege actually very good. The only thing I don't like about this card is we got the Mardu Spirit Dragon that actually actively cares about things having haste, and this isn't the wrong colors for that, so I don't know if we can splash blue in that deck, because it would work really well with that card. But otherwise, the Jeskai mode, kind of meh and situational. Sure, there'll be times when you choose it, but the Temur mode, I think, is kind of a staple level effect. We also got a new dragon land in Maelstrom of the Spirit Dragon, and we might have story time here in a minute. Maelstrom of the Spirit Dragon. It's a land. It makes colorless. Or you can tap it to make a mana of any color, but only use it to cast dragon spells or omen spells. Or you can pay for and sack it to search your library for a dragon card, reveal it, put it in your hand, and shuffle. So Maelstrom of the Spirit Dragon is the third in a long lineage of Spirit Dragon lands. So story time. Back when Fate Reforged released, they printed Crucible of the Spirit Dragon, and one of the things that Wizards told us is the next set is going to be Dragons of Tarkir, and that set's going to have a ton of dragons in it. So Smart Seth was like, this land cares about dragons. Wizards is going to print a whole bunch of dragons. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to buy like 100 copies of Crucible of the Spirit Dragon. I think it might have actually been 47 copies. But I bought a whole bunch of Crucible of the Spirit Dragons because I thought when they print Dragons of Tarkir, I'm going to be rich. Instead, when they printed Dragons of Tarkir, they printed Haven of the Spirit Dragon in Dragons of Tarkir, which was essentially just strictly better Crucible of the Spirit Dragon because it fixed your mana and it let you get dragons back from the graveyard. Crucible of the Spirit Dragon actually just went down in value rather than up, and then eventually it gave them all away to people on the stream. So that's my Crucible of the Spirit Dragon story. The good news is I think Maelstrom of the Spirit Dragon is actually the best of these lands. It fixes your mana, and it actually tutors up a dragon like Inventor's Fair. So I feel like this one's pretty simple. If you're playing a dragon deck in Standard, or in Modern, or in Vintage, or in Pauper, well, not Pauper, that would be illegal, but in basically any format, and definitely in Commander, I would play this land basically every single time. If I was a monocolor, let's say I'm playing Lathless in Commander, I'm a monocolor dragon deck, why would I want a land that makes mana of any color for dragons? I don't, but what I do want is a land that can sack to tutor up a dragon, so I feel like this is just a staple in every dragon deck from now until the end of eternity. Rounding out our rares today, we got 3 that I think are cool cards, but for one reason or another, I'm not expecting them to actually work out the way I want to. So these are definitely like super deep against the odds cards, maybe Commander cards. Number 1, Koris the Fangkeeper. It's a 4-mana 2/1 zombie war. It's a legend. It's indestructible, which doesn't really mean that much anymore. If indestructible meant more, I think this card would be a little bit better, but there's just so much exile-based removal running around that I'm not sure in a world of Leyline Binding and Sunfall, being indestructible is that big of an upside. And then it says, when it deals combat damage to a player, exile the top X cards of their library, where X is the amount of damage dealt. You may cast any number of spells with mana value X or less from among them without paying its mana cost. If that sounds familiar, it's basically Villainous Wealth on a stick. And I love Villainous Wealth. It is one of my favorite cards to resolve in all of Magic. Just stealing all of your opponent's cards and casting them for free is so cool. So why do I think Koris is kind of sketchy? And the answer is, it's a friggin' 2/1. So I play my Koris, I attack you with it, I Villainous Wealth X2, I look at your top 2 cards, and I can only cast things with mana value 2 or less. That's not good at all. For this to be good, I need to somehow get Koris up to like 10 power, 15 power, 20 power. Then I can build a real Villainous Wealth. But that's going to be tough to do. Like, how do I grow this 4-mana 2/1 into a creature big enough to get a meaningful Villainous Wealth out of it? So I feel like it's a fun deck building challenge card in Commander in specific, where you build this like weird Voltron deck where you got to figure out how to grow your Koris and be able to like steal a bunch of your opponent's decks. But as far as being like a good card, especially in a format like Standard, I don't see this one happening. We also got Sidisi, Regent of the Mire, a 2-mana 1/3 legendary zombie snake warlock. This has tap it and sack a creature you control with mana value of X other than Sidisi. Return target creature card with mana value of X +1 from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcery. So if Sidisi sounds familiar, it's essentially Birthing Pod without any mana being attached to it. Birthing Pod for free, but Birthing Pod from your graveyard. So this is another card that I feel like is incredibly cool to build around. I mean, it's a Birthing Pod from your graveyard that you can play in the command zone. So why am I a little bit sketched out about this card? Well, it seems hard to make it work. If you're playing literal Birthing Pod, you're always going to have access to the cards, right? Because they're in your deck. And actually, sometimes you even don't have access to all the cards because you draw what you want to have in your deck. But if you have a Birthing Pod and you sack a Llanowar Elves, you know you can get your Corridor Monitor or whatever 2-drop it is because it's going to be in your deck. If you have Sidisi, not only do you need a Llanowar Elves to sacrifice, you need to make sure you have a Corridor Monitor in your graveyard somehow, which isn't impossible, but it means rather than Birthing Pod, which didn't really require much setup, Sidisi, you're going to need a lot of setup. You're going to have a very full graveyard to make sure you have the right mana values in your graveyard to get any value out of this at all. So that already, I think, is going to be a challenge. The other problem is graveyard hate. There's a lot of Rest in Peace and Ghost Vacuums running around, and if your opponent just locks down your graveyard, no amount of setup that you're going to do is going to get out from under that. Plus, if you're in Modern or something, yeah, like Emperor of Bones, which is probably just an easier mode version of Sidisi. So Sidisi, similar to our last card, he seems like a really fun commander build around, but I don't actually think it's going to work in Standard or Modern. I hope I'm wrong. It would be so cool if there was a Sidisi deck. So I'm rooting against myself in this one, but I actually think this is one of those cards. When you look at it, you're like, oh my god, it looks like Birthing Pod. But then when you actually think through how many steps you got to go through to make it work, you're kind of like, eh. The other thing that kind of kills the card that I didn't mention is it's not search for a creature of its mana value +1 or less. So if you sack a 3-drop, you can't get a 1-drop, a 2-drop, a 3-drop, or a 4-drop. You have to get exactly a 4-drop, which is going to make it even tougher to make sure that you have the exact right card in your graveyard all the time. So I just don't really see how you can easily set up a Birthing Pod chain with it. But like I said, I hope I'm wrong because the design's super cool. We also got a new saga in Rediscover the Way. So a 3-mana Jeskai saga. First 2 lore counters. Look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 1 in your hand, the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. Last lore counter, whenever you cast a non-creature spell this turn, target creature you control gains double strike until end of turn. So Rediscover the Way, it just seems fine. The first 2 lore counters, you basically anticipate twice its sorcery speed, so it's a 3-mana draw 2 with a bunch of selection built in. The last mode, I guess you do a flying crane technique, cast a bunch of spells, give everything double strike, try to kill your opponent. I don't think that Rediscover the Way is a bad card. It just seems like a fillery kind of card. If you're a Jeskai deck that needs a saga, you need an enchantment, you need a non-creature spell, I think it's fine, but it's just not especially flashy or anything. So we'll see. I could see this serving a purpose in Standard just as a way to kind of churn through your deck in Jeskai, but I don't think it's busted or anything like that. As far as lower rarity cards, Wizards actually spoiled a ton of them today, and we're going to breeze through a bunch of them super quickly, but you should check them all out over at MTGpreviews.com. One of the downsides of the first day of spoiler season is they spoil so many rares and mythics that we honestly just can't go through every common and uncommon individually, or have like a 5-hour long video. So there's some stuff, anything that's like super spicy, I got on the list, but there's some stuff that could like round out standard decks or be functional and limited. That's definitely over on MTGpreviews.com. So go check it out if you want to see all the cards. But there's one lower rarity card that I had to mention individually, because this card, even though the card itself is probably bad, it just might change the future of Magic, and that is Sunset Strikemaster. So Sunset Strikemaster, a 2-mana mono red 3/1 human monk. You can pay 3 tap sack it to deal 6 damage to a creature with flying, or you can tap it to add a red mana. That is right, mana dorks are in mono red now. Wizards actually announced on the stream where they spoiled this card that they are shifting mana dorks into mono red. Not that they're taking them away from green, but mono red can now get mana dorks any set at any time. And why Sunset Strikemaster itself is kind of meh. It's like 2 mana, it's only got 1 toughness. This theoretically means we could get mono red Birds of Paradise, mono red Llanowar 4 elves in the future. And honestly, I think this was a good decision. And this might be hypocritical, because normally I'm very critical of what I see as color pie breaks. Like, black getting enchantment removal, I absolutely hate it. I'm always complaining about that. For some reason, red getting mana dorks, though, kind of feels right. So, for one thing, red could always make extra mana. They just did it with rituals, typically. So it doesn't seem weird to me to have red make extra mana with a creature. In some ways, creatures are rituals, because creatures die to farewell all the time. So you're kind of getting temporary mana until the creature dies. So for some reason, it just doesn't seem wrong to me. The other reason, from a more practical perspective, that I think this is good is I think red is the weakest color in Casual Commander. And the biggest reason that red is the weakest color in Casual Commander, it is one of the worst ramp colors in Commander. So I feel like adding mana dorks might help boost the floor of red a little bit in Commander, maybe make the color a little bit more competitive with the rest of the colors, which I think would be a good thing. But let me know what you think. Mono red getting mana dorks, definitely a huge change to Magic after, what, 31 years? But let me know what you think. You like it, you hate it, you want to see more of it? Let me know in the comments. We also got our basic lands from the set. So we got 2 cycles of lands. The one on the top, you can get an any booster. The one on the bottom, the Dragon Eye lands, only in collector boosters. But these lands look super cool. I think they're going to be very popular in Commander, where if you got a Dragon deck, either one of these are going to be perfect additions to make your basics match up with the flavor. Gonna be curious to see how much they cost. I would think that the ones on the top with the Dragon Shadows should be very cheap and accessible, since you can get them in any booster product. The one on the bottoms, though, they only come in collector boosters and are pretty unique looking. I would not be surprised if they actually were a little bit valuable. But anyway, super cool basics, perfect for Dragon decks. We also found out that we're getting fetch lands in the set, but they're special guests. So, Misty Rainforest, Arid Mesa, Marshflat, Scalding Dart, Verticatacombs, coming in Tarkir Dragonstorm, but being special guests means they're not actually standard legal. Honestly, Wizards didn't spoil any rare lands today, so we really don't know what the land cycle is, if there even is a land cycle. I imagine there has to be a land cycle to support the wedge theme, but we do know that we're getting these fetches as special guests, which, awesome choice. Like, fetch lands, even at this point, where they're not nearly as expensive as they were a few years back, they are still iconic. They're really exciting opens. They should be $30, $40, $50 cards you can crack in a booster pack. Plus, it gives more art for you to use to customize your Commander decks or Modern decks or whatever deck, because they play them in pretty much every format. The rest of the special guests, maybe not quite as valuable. It's the Ultimatum cycle that we got from Ikoria, and these cards are very strong, like Eerie Ultimatum, Ruinous Ultimatum, Commander Staples, Emergent Ultimatum, sometimes Constructed combo piece. Not super high value cards, but cool looking special guest cards. Otherwise, we get a bunch of Commander cards. Tomer's going to cover all that stuff over on the Commander channel, but I wanted to pop them up so you knew they existed. They spoiled pretty much all the face cards from the Commander decks, and then they're going to start spoiling one Commander deck a day starting tomorrow. So lots of Commander spoilers over on the MTGGoldfish Commander channel. Otherwise, we just get a ton of lore rarity stuff, some monuments for mana fixing and limited, and then just a ton of commons and uncommons, which, as I said before, we can't talk about them all individually, but you can check them all out over at mtgpreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Tarkir Dragonstorm spoilers for today, and I gotta say, I am absolutely thrilled. This is exactly, and I mean exactly, what I was hoping for. It feels like old Tarkir. It's so nostalgic. It's so awesome to see the wedges back, to see the clans back, to see all these dragons, these callbacks to old cards and mechanics. I love this set. I was already like an 8 or 9 out of 10 on my hype scale, just because I love Tarkir and it's so nostalgic for me. But seeing these spoilers and seeing how Wizards has done it right, I'm a 10 out of 10 now. I don't think I've ever been 10 out of 10 for a set before, but I am fully hyped for this set. But let me know what you think. What's your hype level? What do you think about these spoilers? What card are you most excited to build around? Let me know in the comments, and I'll be back tomorrow with more Tarkir Dragonstorm spoilers. So until then, have an amazing day, and I will talk to you soon.